Like marriages, friendships experience highs and lows. With those closest to you, you share your life, your pleasures, and even your challenges. However, such connections can occasionally become hazy, and you may transcend boundaries you never would have imagined. I never thought that I would be forced to reevaluate all of my beliefs regarding loyalty, love, and friendship. But then it took place. I didn't even realize the line had been crossed until I was standing on the other side, since it happened so slowly. Claire is my name. I am 36 years old, have 2 children, and have been married to Mike for more than 10 years. As far as the outside world was concerned, our marriage is stable. Our lives are comfortable, if not predictable, and we have a daily routine with our children. We reside in a suburban home. Mike and I no longer share the same level of enthusiasm that we did when we first met. At times, it seems more like we are co-managers of life than lovers. I couldn't help but miss the spark we had together, even though I knew this wasn't uncommon in committed partnerships. Emma, my best friend, comes next. Since I can remember, we have been friends. She married Greg, a successful, affable, and loving father who appeared like the ideal match for her. Everyone admired Emma and Greg as a couple since they were always well-groomed and smiling at social gatherings. However, things weren't that ideal behind closed doors. As these things often occur, the story began innocently enough. Greg had always been amiable, laid back, and a pleasure to be around. Emma used to joke that Greg had a best friend who would be ideal for me if I ever wanted to get rid of Mike. As years passed, the lighthearted banter changed its tone, but it was always said in jest. Everything started on a Friday night. Mike and I received an invitation from Emma to join them for supper. While the four of us talked and shared a bottle of wine, our children played upstairs. As usual, the evening was full of old stories, laughter, and catching up on each other's lives. At one point, Greg and I were left alone on the patio while Mike and Emma walked into the kitchen to get more drinks. Even though we were seated in cozy calm, I could sense Greg watching me. "Are you and Mike still going strong?" he inquired in a low voice with a tinge of interest. I shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "We're fine. You know how it is after years of marriage. Things settle down." Greg nodded, his eyes locking with mine. "Yeah, Emma and I are the same. It's comfortable. Sometimes too comfortable." That was the first time Greg had ever hinted that his marriage wasn't as perfect as it seemed. I didn't know how to respond, so I offered a half-hearted smile. "I guess that's just how it goes." Greg leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you ever miss it? The excitement?" I blinked, startled by his question. My heart skipped a beat. Was Greg flirting with me? I felt a sudden flush of heat creep up my neck, but I shook it off. "Sometimes," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty in my words. "But life is busy. Kids, work, keeping the house running. It doesn't leave much room for excitement." Greg's gaze softened as he looked at me, and for a moment, I could feel a connection forming between us. Something I hadn't anticipated. The tension in the air was palpable. Before either of us could say anything more, Mike and Emma returned with drinks, and the moment passed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between Greg and me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to brush off the encounter as nothing more than a passing moment. But Greg and I began to see each other more often, at playdates, dinners, and family events. Each time we were around one another, I could feel the tension building. Our conversations grew longer, the eye contact lingered, and the way he looked at me made me question everything. One afternoon, Emma called, asking if I could pick up her kids from school. She was swamped with work, and Greg was stuck in a meeting. I agreed, as I had done many times before, and brought their kids back to my place to play with mine. By the time Greg arrived to pick them up, the kids were playing in the living room, and I was finishing up some work in the kitchen. "Thanks for helping out, Claire," Greg said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You really saved us today." I smiled, looking up from my laptop. "No problem at all. The kids love playing together." There was a moment of silence as Greg watched me, his eyes lingering on mine. "You and Emma have been friends for a long time," he said, his voice low. "She's lucky to have you." There was something in his tone, a softness that made my stomach twist. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken words hanging in the air between us. "Greg," I began, unsure of what to say next. But before I could finish, he took a step closer. "I've been thinking about you, Claire," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. I haven't felt this way in a long time." My heart pounded in my chest as his words sank in. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him we couldn't go down this path, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached out and gently touched my hand. "Claire, Greg's voice was barely above a whisper as he took another step forward, closing the gap between us. I should have pulled away. I should have told him to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I let him kiss me. That kiss changed everything. In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line that we couldn't uncross. It was a line that would have consequences for everyone involved. For Mike, for Emma, for our families. And yet, standing there in Greg's arms, I didn't care. I wanted him, and he wanted me, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we had done came crashing down around us. I could see the guilt in Greg's eyes, the same guilt I felt twisting in my gut. "We shouldn't have done that," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." Greg nodded, his expression pained. "I know, but I can't help how I feel, Claire. I've been drawn to you for a long time." I stepped back, putting some distance between us. "We can't do this, Greg. We can't." But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't over. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable, and over the next few weeks it only grew stronger. We began texting each other, finding excuses to see one another, and eventually we gave in to the temptation. We started an affair. The affair lasted for months, hidden in the shadows of our lives. We would meet in secret, at hotels, in Greg's car, even at my house when Mike was away. Every time we were together, it felt like we were walking on a knife's edge, knowing that one wrong move could expose everything. But the secrecy only added to the excitement. The thrill of sneaking around, the stolen moments, the forbidden kisses, it all made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Greg made me feel desired, wanted, and in those moments, I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about the risk. I was addicted to the rush of being with him. But eventually, the weight of our lies began to catch up with us. The guilt became harder to ignore, and the strain of keeping the affair a secret started to take its toll. I could feel the distance growing between Mike and me, and I knew he suspected something was wrong. But he never asked, and I never told. One evening, after yet another secret rendezvous with Greg, I came home to find Mike sitting at the kitchen table, his expression grim. I knew in that moment that he had figured it out. "Claire, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with emotion. My heart raced as I sat down across from him. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike looked at me, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. "I know about you and Greg." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "Mike, I don't want to hear excuses," he interrupted, his voice shaking with anger. "I just want to know why. Why did you do this?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," I whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Mike. I never wanted to hurt you." Mike stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "It's too late for that, Claire. You've already hurt me." Mike's words echoed in my mind. I had hurt him deeply. There was no undoing what had been done, and I felt the weight of my actions crushing me. I had betrayed my husband, the father of my children, and there was no way to sugarcoat it. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the unspoken words that hung in the air. I knew I needed to explain, but I didn't know where to begin. How could I explain something that even I didn't fully understand? "I never wanted to hurt you, Mike," I repeated softly, my voice trembling. "But things between us, they haven't been the same for a long time." Mike's expression softened slightly, but the pain in his eyes remained. "You could have talked to me, Claire. We could have worked through it together. Instead, you turned to Greg, my best friend. Do you have any idea how much that hurts?" Tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded, guilt consuming me. I know it was wrong. I don't even know why it happened, Mike. It just did." Mike shook his head, standing up from the table and pacing the kitchen. "That's not good enough, Claire. It just happened. That's not an excuse. You made a choice to betray me, to betray our marriage." "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. For a moment, Mike didn't say anything. He just stood there, his back turned to me, his shoulders tense. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I knew that nothing I did could make this better. "What do we do now?" I finally asked, my voice shaky. Mike turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I need time to think." And with that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Mike barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was only about the kids or logistical things. It was clear that he was struggling to process what had happened, and I didn't blame him. I was struggling too. I had destroyed the trust in our marriage, and I wasn't sure if we could ever rebuild it. As for Greg, we stopped communicating altogether. He had called and texted a few times, but I ignored him. I couldn't face him. The guilt was too overwhelming, and I knew that continuing the affair would only make things worse. It was over. It had to be over. But even though I had ended things with Greg, the damage had already been done. Mike knew the truth, and our marriage was hanging by a thread. I had betrayed the man I loved, and I wasn't sure if there was any way to come back from that. One evening, about a week after Mike had confronted me, we finally sat down to talk. The kids were in bed, and the house was quiet. I could feel the tension in the air as we sat across from each other, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. "Claire," Mike began, his voice low, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about us, and I need to know. Do you still want to be with me? Do you still love me?" His question hit me like a ton of bricks. Of course I still loved him. But love alone wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes, Mike," I said, my voice shaking. "I love you. I never stopped loving you." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't understand how we got here, Claire. We were supposed to be a team. We were supposed to face everything together. And now, I don't know if we can come back from this." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him. "I don't know either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try. I want to fix this, Mike. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mike stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Claire. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my heart break all over again. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm asking you to give me a chance to make things right." For a long time, Mike didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Finally, he spoke. "I'm willing to try," he said quietly, "but it's going to take time, Claire. A lot of time." Relief washed over me, and I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I understand," I whispered. "I'll wait as long as it takes." In the weeks that followed, Mike and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were making no progress at all. But little by little, we began to talk more openly, to be more honest with each other about our feelings and our needs. We started going to couples therapy, and though the sessions were tough, they were also helpful. Mike was distant at first, and I knew it would take time for him to trust me again. But I was committed to doing whatever it took to repair the damage I had caused. I knew that our marriage would never be the same, but I was determined to make it stronger than it had been before. As for Greg and Emma, they eventually found out about the affair as well. Emma was devastated, and their marriage fell apart. I felt guilty for being a part of their downfall, but I couldn't change what had happened. All I could do was focus on my own relationship with Mike and hope that, in time, we could heal. Months passed, and though things were far from perfect, Mike and I slowly began to find our way back to each other. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to bear, but we were trying, both of us, and that was what mattered. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Mike reached for my hand. I looked over at him, surprised by the gesture. "We've come a long way," he said quietly, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "We have." "I'm not saying everything is fixed," he continued, "but I think we're getting there. Slowly." I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered, for giving us a chance." Mike smiled, a small, tentative smile that made my heart ache with love for him. "You're my wife, Claire, and despite everything, I still love you." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I leaned over and kissed him, a soft, gentle kiss that felt like the first step toward healing. It wasn't the end of our journey, but it was a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. In the end, I learned that love and trust are fragile things, easily broken, but not impossible to mend. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to face the darkest parts of yourself. But if you're willing to put in the work, sometimes, just sometimes, you can find your way back to the people you love. And that's what Mike and I were doing, finding our way back, one step at a time.